I have stated many times that one of the main reasons I lost my faith in Islam is the contradiction between a wise and merciful God and eternal torture. So you can imagine my surprise at discovering that Ibn Taymiyyah, Shaykh al-Islam himself, agreed with me. In 1995, a relatively little-known manuscript of Ibn Taymiyyah's was edited and published, entitled Ar-Radd ala man qala bi fana al-Jannah wan-nar, Response to whoever says that the garden and fire will pass away. It was written near the end of Ibn Taymiyyah's life, and so it is his last published work on the matter. A link to the book, plus a paper discussing it, is in the info box. Ibn Taymiyyah begins the book by outlining three possible views on the duration of heaven and hell. Both pass away, both remain forever, heaven remains forever, but hell passes away. He refutes the first and the second view, but defends the third. He cites textual evidence from Qur'an and Sunnah that suggests hell is finite. Then he moves on to arguments about the nature of God and how divine wisdom and mercy is incompatible with the belief in eternal hell. He argues that God's all-encompassing wisdom and mercy precludes eternal torture, and that God is far above creating people from the outset, knowing they will simply suffer unbearable agony without end. He asserts that God has a wise purpose in everything he does, and since there is no purpose to eternal torture, it can only be limited, and its wise purpose is to be found in cleansing disbelievers from sins and purifying their souls from kufr and shirk. He responds to those who argue that the Qur'an says the wicked can never be reformed by arguing that this verse is talking about those who have not yet been purified by the fire, and it does not mean that kufr and shirk are intractable conditions that God is incapable of curing. He then adds, "As for God creating souls who commit evil in this world, while in the hereafter they will only exist in torment, this is a contradiction which contradicts wisdom and mercy like nothing else." Ibn Taymiyyah's arguments fall into approximately two categories: textual arguments and arguments based on the nature of God. It's clear that his textual arguments are not sufficient to refute the doctrine of eternal hell on their own. He certainly does an excellent job of making his case, but the fact is, there are far more verses that explicitly confirm hell is eternal, and the weight of evidence based on texts alone leans heavily in favor of an eternal hell. It is not without reason that the majority of scholars, past and present, have reached ijma', consensus, on this matter. At best, one could argue that the Qur'an contradicts itself, but this of course is unthinkable for those that believe the Qur'an is the literal word of God. Nevertheless, the very fact that there can even be a serious discussion on this question is problematic for the Qur'an. This is not a minor issue. Salvation and damnation go to the very heart of the message of Islam. Many scholars make belief in the eternality of hell an article of faith, and rejecting it an act of kufr. So since the Qur'an claims to be the literal speech of God, it cannot be seen to speak with two contradictory voices on such a crucial matter. As I mentioned, Ibn Taymiyyah's textual arguments alone are not sufficient to completely refute the doctrine of eternal hell. It is the second type of argument he presents, those based on the nature of God, that are essential in order to tip the balance decisively against eternal hell. And this is the most revealing point about his book. He is applying his own reasoning to God. He is relying on the limited human mind to make judgments about what divine nature and motives should or should not be. This is precisely what many scholars of Islam warn against, that human standards of what is acceptable and not acceptable cannot be applied to God, who alone defines these things according to his divine wisdom. But this is the dilemma Islam presents us with. We are told we cannot apply our fallible and limited human mind to God, yet humans have no other way of judging religious claims other than by using the human mind, limited and fallible as it may be. Ibn Taymiyyah recognizes that there is a fundamental moral contradiction between the notion of eternal torture and a wise and merciful God. This contradiction is so overwhelmingly compelling to him that he was willing to risk contradicting the ijma' of the scholars. Yet he was, of course, unwilling to take it a step further and question the Qur'an itself. Instead, he formulated a theological workaround, a theodicy that would allow him to backward rationalize his own human reasoning into the mouth of God. This is the dilemma most rational Muslims face. What do you do when you find something in the Qur'an that doesn't make sense to your own limited mind? Most will respond with, "You must trust in God. He knows that which you do not know." A minority, such as progressives, will search for apologetics to get around it. They argue, "We have misunderstood the Qur'an. It doesn't mean that, it means this." Only a very tiny minority will ever question the Qur'an itself. Faith encompasses one's whole identity, worldview, meaning, direction, and comfort. Losing that is not something most could bear even contemplating. But the truth is that the difference between Ibn Taymiyyah on this topic and someone who questions the Qur'an itself is not as huge as you might think. It's simply a question of how far one is willing to follow this line of reasoning to its natural conclusion. Despite the numerous attempts by scholars to reconcile the issue of a merciful God with eternal torture, it remains an insoluble contradiction that deeply troubles the minds of not only many ordinary Muslims, but some of their great scholars. While on the other hand, those who attempt to reconcile it by arguing that hell is simply a place of temporary purification only raise the uncomfortable question, was God not able to express himself clearly?